On the evening of July 25th, 2008, a 59-year-old man named Brian Thomas walked hand in hand with his wife Christine out of the restaurant where they had just had dinner. The couple was in this little village right on the coast of Wales, and where they were now walking outside of this restaurant was right along the water. And so as they did that, Brian found himself looking out over the sea, and he saw the reflection of the moon on the waves, and it was so beautiful. And then he turned to his wife, and she was so stunning. And so Brian finally just stopped and kind of just took in all this incredible beauty right in front of him, and he began smiling ear to ear, which was a big departure from how Brian had been feeling over the past few months, because Christine had recently had a big scare. She had been told she might have cancer, and so she went in for all this testing, and then she and Brian had to wait for it to come back, and the wait was absolute torture. I mean, basically Brian and Christine were prepping themselves to find out Christine really did have cancer. But when the results did come back, it would turn out Christine did not have cancer, and so Christine was obviously hugely relieved, but it was actually Brian who was more relieved. It was like he suddenly saw he could lose his wife of 40 years, who he had raised a family with. I mean, this was like the most important person in Brian's life, but it was like he didn't fully appreciate that until he realized he could lose this really important person. And so now that Christine had a clean bill of health, Brian was committed to showering her with love and affection and taking her to restaurants and on vacations. And in fact, the reason they were actually in this village in Wales is because they were on one of Brian's many vacations for Christine. He had gone out and bought this little camper van, and they had driven it up to this part of Wales. And then after this vacation ended, Brian's plan was to use this camper to travel with his wife all over Great Britain. And so the couple had a really busy schedule coming up. But for right now, Brian was focused on just staying in the moment and enjoying this newfound happiness he was feeling. And so he and his wife would continue to just kind of walk along the water for a bit. And then finally, when they felt tired, they headed back to their camper, they went inside, they got in their bed, and they fell asleep. A little before 4 a.m., Brian suddenly woke up inside of this camper. And so he sits upright and he looks around. You know, it's totally dark inside of there. He can't see anything. He doesn't really know why he just woke up. And he's trying to get his bearings. And then as his eyes kind of begin to focus, he realizes there is a person standing inside of their camper right near the door. Basically 10, 15 feet away from he and his wife is a person. And so Brian just froze and he's staring at this person, hoping this is just a dream or something. But then this person, who appeared to be dressed in all black head to toe, began to move. And they began to move first to the left and then towards the bed. And so Brian is still just frozen, thinking, is this real? Is this really happening? And then this person began climbing on the bed on the side where Christine was. And so Brian, without even thinking, just yelled out, "You bastard!" And he jumped off the bed at this guy and began choking them out. And the whole time Brian is screaming at this person, like, "What are you doing? Why are you here?" And this person is fighting back so hard, and Brian is just not letting go. It's like instinct is completely taken over, and then this person goes totally still and just dies. And Brian knows he killed them, but they came into his camper. Like, what do you expect? Brian would ultimately be the one who called the police, and just several minutes later they would show up, and when they got there they would find Brian standing outside the camper hyperventilating. And then when they tried to get more information about what exactly had happened inside the camper, Brian basically couldn't explain it. It was like he was totally in shock. And so eventually one of the officers just went inside the camper, and there on the ground they would find a body. But it was not some attacker. It was Brian's wife. It would turn out Brian had a medical condition called somnambulism, which we know as sleepwalking. And at home, he would sleep in a different bed than his wife because he sleepwalked so much. But since they were on vacation in their camper, they had to sleep together because there was only one bed on board the camper. And so not long after Brian and Christine had fallen asleep together, Brian began having this really intense nightmare where he believed his wife was being attacked. And so Brian, in this nightmare, had to stop this person from hurting Christine. Except, because of his sleepwalking, he acted this out in real life. And the attacker that he ultimately killed was ironically his wife. He basically tackled his wife and strangled her to death because he thought he was actually saving her. Brian was absolutely destroyed with grief and with guilt, and the second he realized what he had done, he confessed. He didn't in any way try to protect himself. He said, "I did this, take me in." and Brian would be arrested. However, in November of 2009, the judge who actually heard Brian's official confession, he kind of felt bad for Brian and said, you know what, I'm dropping all charges against you because it's obvious to me you are a good and decent person. This was a mistake, and you're going to live with grief and guilt for the rest of your life, and that's punishment enough. In 2003, Kevin Mannis owned an antique shop right in downtown Portland at the base of the Burnside Bridge, which is considered the gateway to the city. Because Kevin owned this antique shop, he was always at yard sales and estate sales looking to find the next thing he could sell at his shop. And so one day there was this estate sale over at this woman's house. She had just passed away. She was about 103 years old. She was a Holocaust survivor, and her estate was being sold. And so he goes over to the house and he sees the way they're selling all of her items is by bundling them in different lots. So depending on what item it was, they'd be bundled with similar items and then sold as a package. So the people there would be bidding on the whole lot. They couldn't buy individual items. And Kevin had his eye on one particular lot called Lot 29. And Lot 29 included a couple of small tools that he wanted to sell in his shop. And it had this mystery box, and that's exactly as it was labeled. It just says mystery box on it. And he was intrigued by it. And so he placed a bid on Lot 29, and ultimately he won the bid, and he was really happy about it. So he takes the contents of Lot 29 and he wheels them over to his car. And as he's loading stuff into the back of his car, someone behind him says, "Oh, so you went with the Dybbuk box, huh?" And Kevin, in his head, went right back to his childhood because growing up, he had always been scared of Dybbuks because a Dybbuk is a malevolent spirit in Jewish folklore, and Kevin was Jewish, and so his parents used to say, "Oh, you better not do that, Kevin, or the Dybbuk's gonna get you." And so he grew up terrified of Dybbuks, and so his interest is piqued. And Kevin turns around and he says, "Did you just call this box a Dybbuk box?" And the woman's like, "Yeah, and my grandmother was terrified of it, and she said no one could ever open it." And Kevin turns to look at the box, and it's about 2 foot high by 1 foot wide. And there are these little doors that swing open on the front. And then on the bottom, there's a drawer that comes out. And there's one lock that sits across the 2 doors, and it's currently locked with a little padlock. And he looks up at her and he goes, "Why can't you open it?" And the woman just says, "We never knew, but our grandmother would always go every time we said the word Dybbuk. And so it was weird enough that we just never asked any questions and we stayed away from her Dybbuk box." Kevin agreed that was pretty weird, and he finished loading his car, shut the trunk, said bye to the woman, hopped in his car, and he drove away. And he never really gave it a second thought. At this point, he's not thinking the Dybbuk box is anything malevolent. He thinks it's just some random chest that he won at an auction. Kevin drives back to his antique shop, and he begins unloading all the things he won at the auction. He brings them inside and he brings them downstairs because the top floor, the main floor, was really where he sold things. When he got new items, he would bring them downstairs to his warehouse of sorts, which was much bigger than the first floor, had lots of rows of shelving, and it had a workstation down there. He would bring his new things down there and he would price them and get them ready before bringing them back up. And at some point, he brought the Dybbuk box in and he brought it down and he put it on the back table. He was about to just leave it there and go back upstairs when suddenly he became really curious and he really wanted to open the Dybbuk box. And so he goes over and he kind of yanks on the front 2 doors. He doesn't want to damage it, but he can tell this lock is relatively new and it's not just going to come off. And so he doesn't have the key to it and he doesn't have a way to clip the lock. And so he takes a screwdriver and he basically wedges it underneath the actual metal clasps that are attached to the wood. And he slowly kind of bends it up and bends it off and pops it out of the wood. And as soon as he does that, the doors swing open and there's like a mechanical device inside of the Dybbuk box that activates the drawer. Basically, anytime the doors open, the drawer also opens at the same time. And Kevin remembered thinking how silly it was that this kind of old, crummy-looking wine closet had this fairly complicated mechanism inside of it that still worked. Inside the Dybbuk box were 2 pennies from the 1920s. There was a used candle. There were 2 locks of hair. There was this small tombstone that said Shalom on it. And there was also a small wine goblet that was inside. And that was it. And Kevin immediately thought, well, this is just some older woman's keepsake. And these things maybe have sentimental value to her, but they don't to me. And so he shut the Dybbuk box, pushed it to the side of the desk, and walked upstairs and didn't give it another thought. Kevin had one employee at the antique shop. Her name was Jane. She was a younger woman. She was an incredible saleswoman, and Kevin thought very highly of her. And so the day after he had brought the Dybbuk box into the antique shop and put it downstairs on the desk, he needed to run out and do some errands, and so he put Jane in charge of the store. And so Kevin leaves, and Jane locks the front door to the shop behind Kevin because she needed to go downstairs and get a few items that she wanted to bring upstairs to sell that day, and it was before opening time. So front door's locked, no one else is inside the shop, and Jane goes down into the basement. Once you went down the wooden steps into the basement, you'd be looking out at this huge room of all these industrial shelves that run the length of the room where they would keep their antiques and other valuables on. And the lighting down there was never that great because they used these long fluorescent tube lights that at best cast a kind of subtle yellow glow on everything. They were not particularly bright, and it was a real pain to actually go up and change them because you needed to place a ladder, but the ladders were not perfectly aligned with the lights. You basically had to reach over the shelving where all the antiques were, and you ran the risk of knocking things over. And so a lot of times Jane and Kevin would wait until you were down to like 1 or 2 crappy working lights before they'd say, okay, we really got to go up there and replace some of these bulbs. And so as it happens this day, they're down to like 2 or 3 working lights. So in classic horror movie fashion, she's going into this dingy basement with very poor lighting. And so once she gets to the bottom of the steps, she walks to the far end of the room, a little bit away from where the Dybbuk box was placed on that back table. She's in the other corner in the back of this basement, and she's getting some things off the shelf when all of a sudden she stops, and she can't help but shake the feeling that she feels like someone is watching her. Now, she is down in this basement all the time, whether it's well lit or dark, whether Kevin is there with her or she's alone. This is a place she goes all the time. And she's never had this feeling before. There's no way to get into the basement unless you come down the stairs, and she locked the front door, and she was the only one who came downstairs. She hasn't heard anything. There's no other way to leave this space. So she doesn't know where she's getting this feeling from, but she really can't shake it. And as she's kind of looking around and she's starting to get a little bit paranoid, the phone rings. They had a landline that was on a table right at the base of the stairs. The phone rings down there, and it startles her. And then it kind of jumps her back into reality, and she's like, okay, I'm getting paranoid. And she walks over and she picks up the phone, and it's actually her friend who was planning on coming by the antique shop that day. So as they're chatting, Jane hears what sounds like a broom. Imagine if a push broom is lined up against the wall and then it falls over. The sound that the wooden stick would make as it hits concrete. That's the sound she hears as she's on the phone. And it startles her again, and she goes, hey, let me call you back. She hangs up on her friend, and she's looking out, and because the lighting is terrible from where she is, she's now at the foot of the stairs looking down all these rows, and she's heard that stick land on the ground on the far side back where she had been originally. She's kind of looking around, and she can't see anything. And so she takes a deep breath, and she begins walking down the rows to see what fell over. And as she's walking down the row, something smashes behind her, and she turns around, and one of the fluorescent tube lights has fallen from the ceiling and smashed onto the ground. And so all of a sudden, she doesn't want to explore this falling broom that's behind her in the dark corner of the basement. Instead, she's ready to leave. And so she starts walking back towards the stairs to get out of here. And as she's walking down one of these rows, a wooden chair that is on one of the shelves comes flying off of it and lands squarely in the middle, blocking her path. And there's no way this could have happened unless someone pushed this chair. And suddenly she thinks, someone's down here with me. And she screams and she hurdles the chair and she runs to the steps. She starts running up. And to her horror, there is a metal door that locks the basement at night. So if someone were to break in, it's another layer to protect the store from thieves. And it was shut and locked. It can only be locked from the outside and with a key. So there's no way she would have done this by accident. And now she's freaking out because she's trapped in the basement with some person running around, pushing chairs over and breaking lights. And so she grabs the gate and she starts shaking it, and she's yelling for Kevin, thinking maybe he came in and forgot I was down here and shut and locked the gate. And she's checking over her shoulder, looking down into the basement, and she starts hearing more lights falling off the ceiling and shattering on the ground. She is in absolute panic mode. She's just waiting for someone to come bounding up the stairs towards her. She has no idea what to do. She pulls out her phone and she calls Kevin. Meanwhile, Kevin is making his way back to the antique shop. He's only a couple minutes away, and he sees his phone ringing that was sitting on the passenger seat, and he picks it up, and it's Jane. And he answers, and immediately Jane is hysterical, and she's screaming that someone's in the antique shop that's breaking things. And Kevin's like, slow down, what's going on? And all he can hear in the background is the sound of what sounds like glass shattering and things falling and breaking. And he's like, wait, what's going on? Are you okay, Jane? Like, where are you? And he hears her say, someone's in the basement. And he goes, where are you? And she's like, I'm in the basement. And he was like, get out of the basement, call the police. But as he's trying to get her to do that, the phone cuts out. Kevin was only about a block away from his shop, so he floors it to his shop. He parks outside and he's thinking to himself, what am I walking into? Is there going to be like an active burglary going on? Is she going to be held hostage? Like, are the police going to be there? But he just knows he needs to get in there to Jane, and he gets to the front door and it's locked. So he unlocks the front door and he goes inside and it's silent. He's looking around. There's no damage to the first floor. There's no damage anywhere. And he yells for Jane. There's no answer from Jane. And he starts walking kind of tentatively through the store towards the back. And he gets to that door leading down into the basement, the same one that Jane couldn't open when she ran up the stairs to get out of the basement. And he looks at it, and Jane's not at the top of the stairs anymore. And he's thinking, I didn't lock that door, and I'm the only one with the key to lock that door. How is it locked right now? Does Jane have a key that I don't know about? And why would she lock it? Does that mean Jane's up here somewhere? Is that what happened? And he's like, Jane, come out. Did you lock this door? But Jane's not on the first floor, and their first floor is very small. And so he thinks, okay, she has to be downstairs. And so he opens up the gate, he swings it open, and he starts walking down the steps. And he's really cautious as he's going down because, again, he has no idea what he's walking into. He hits the lights, but the lights don't work down there. And as he starts to bend around the corner where he can actually see into the basement, he sees Jane sitting at the chair right next to that table where that phone is. And she's just sitting there kind of stunned. And he goes to Jane and he's like, what happened down here? And he glances out quickly at all the rows and he sees all this furniture that's come off the shelves and there's glass all over the ground. And he's looking at Jane and Jane's just showing no reaction. She's sitting there like she's in shock. And he turns to Jane again and he says, come on, you got to tell me what happened down here. And Jane just goes, I don't know. I don't know how to explain what happened down here. I was walking down the row and then I felt like someone was watching me and then things are falling off the ceiling and the shelves. I've never seen anything like this before. Now at this point, Kevin's adrenaline is through the roof. He came charging in here thinking he was going to have to save Jane from some person breaking in and breaking stuff. But as far as he can tell, there's no one here but Jane. And so he decides he's going to take a flashlight and he's going to explore the basement because either there's someone here or Jane did this. So he grabs his flashlight and he starts walking around and all he sees is a bunch of broken glass and some furniture that's come off the shelves and a couple other things that are on the ground. But other than that, there's no one down here and there's no other way to come in or out of here besides the stairs. So after Kevin is certain that no one else is here, he turns to Jane and he regrets this now. He says in an interview that he feels horrible about this now, but at the time he's thinking to himself, this had to have been Jane. Who else would have done this? I don't know why she did this, but there's no one else here. And he goes, Jane, did you do this? And this is when Jane's emotions came through because before she was in shock, now she's mad. And she goes, F you, Kevin. And she leaves and she doesn't say another word to him and she doesn't come back. She quits on the spot. But at the time, Kevin believed she had done it. So he was kind of like, oh, well, he was not even a little bit thinking the Dybbuk box had anything to do with this. Just a couple of days after the basement incident, Kevin's mother was supposed to come by the antique shop and the two of them were going to leave and get lunch together to celebrate her birthday. As soon as she walked into the shop, Kevin goes, hey mom, I got a gift for you. And he brings over this wrapped box and he sets it down on a table right in front of his mother who's sitting on a chair. And he unwraps it and it's the Dybbuk box. Before Kevin can explain what it is, the phone rings at the other end of the store and he was expecting a call. And he goes, hold on, Mom, I gotta get this. And he goes to the back of the store to answer the call while his mom is just sitting there looking at the box. And so while Kevin is at the other end of the store, his mother opens the Dybbuk box and she says she had to sit down as soon as she opened it because she had this unbelievable, overwhelming sense of dread as soon as the doors were open. And she's staring at it like she can't take her eyes away. And then all of a sudden she has a massive stroke. And so she keels over and she can't move and she can't talk. And Kevin sees this happening. He runs over and he's like, Mom, what's going on? Calls 911. And as the paramedics are working on her, she would say that while she was in this kind of paralyzed state, when she couldn't talk and she couldn't move, all she wanted to communicate was to somehow get her son to get rid of that box. She didn't know why, but she felt like the box had something to do with her having the stroke. And so all she could do was move her eyes. And so she found herself, because her son's right here, looking at the Dybbuk box and looking away, looking at the Dybbuk box, looking away, hoping her son would see her eyes as a signal to look at the Dybbuk box and put it together that that thing's bad. And Kevin does realize that his mom is flicking her eyes at the Dybbuk box, but in the moment, he's much more concerned about the health of his mother. And it wasn't until she got put in a hospital and she was being taken care of and he knew she'd be okay, that he remembers, he kind of went over it in his head later that day, that his mom was really scared looking and she was looking at the Dybbuk box like that was the thing that was causing her to be scared. Not the stroke, the Dybbuk box. And Kevin starts thinking to himself, I don't know, there's something off about the Dybbuk box. Either it's really bad luck, or there's some truth to you don't open up this Dybbuk box. Either way, I don't want to take any more chances because so long as I've owned this thing, I've had a horrible thing happen in the basement and now my mom's had a stroke. So I want to get rid of it. So Kevin puts the Dybbuk box at the front of his antique store and he puts it up for sale. And very quickly, a young couple came into the store and they bought the Dybbuk box. And Kevin's relieved. He's like, thank goodness that bad luck charm, that whatever's going on with that thing is gone and out of my life. But just a couple of days later, he was in the back of the shop when he heard the door open and then the door shut. And he walked out expecting to see some customers, but instead he sees the Dybbuk box that's sitting right inside his store. Someone must have just dropped it off. And so he walks up to it and he sees there's a piece of paper that's been taped to the top of the Dybbuk box. And there's writing on it. And all it says is, this has an odd darkness about it. This really freaked Kevin out because in a way, it was like other people were confirming that something was wrong with this box. Kevin did not want the Dybbuk box to be in his store. So he put it in his car and he drove back to his house and he put it in his storage locker and he locked it up and then went back to work for the day. That night when he went home, he went to bed and he had this dream. Where in the dream, he's walking in this courtyard and he's holding the hand of this woman who he believes is his friend and he trusts this person. And the area he's in feels very friendly and it's a very positive dream. And as he's walking, all of a sudden, this person starts to pull away from him and he can't move anymore. And he's losing the grip on this person's hand. And they keep moving and moving until their hand is out of his. And they disappear into the corner of the courtyard where it's totally dark. And so he's looking into the darkness, waiting for his friend to come out again. And he can't move. He's anchored to the spot. And as he's looking, he sees what looks like an old woman walking out of the mist. And her head is down and he can't tell what she's doing. And she's pretty far away and she's walking closer and closer to him. And when she's about 5-6 feet away, she raises her head up and her whole face is falling off. All the skin is falling off of her face. It's rotting. She's like a corpse. And she raises her hands up in front of her. Then she grabs his face and begins pulling off pieces of his face until he suddenly wakes up. Kevin had to compose himself in bed because he was so scared from the dream he just had. He sits up and he goes into the bathroom to get a sip of water. And as he walks past the mirror, he notices there are marks on his shoulders and his arms that he did not have before. It looks like bruising almost. And he's looking at them and he's thinking, no way. That has nothing to do with the dream. This is just coincidence that, she was grabbing me in this area in the dream and now I have marks there. It's just coincidence. And so he kind of writes it off and he goes back to bed. And he has the same dream. He gets up again and he's breathing heavily. He's sweating because he just had the same dream. It was this terrifying dream. And he goes back into the bathroom and now his entire back is covered in bruises. He has bruises all over his back, all over his arms. He's got red marks on his neck. And now, in his mind, he feels like it has to do with the Dybbuk box. The Dybbuk box is now in my backyard. It's not a coincidence that all of a sudden I'm having these horrific dreams that are apparently manifesting themselves in bruises and marks on my actual body. And so Kevin is done with the Dybbuk box, and instead of going back to bed, he goes to his computer and he puts the Dybbuk box on eBay up for sale. And that night, two college kids named Sam and Brian, who lived in Missouri, they buy the Dybbuk box, and Kevin could not be happier to package that thing up and ship it off. Sam and Brian had seen the ad on eBay for the Dybbuk box, and at first it did not seem remarkable, but they saw that Kevin had given this really detailed description of all the strange things that had happened for him since he owned the Dybbuk box. And I think clearly Kevin's angle was he was almost trying to advertise it to groups of people that might be interested in that. And Sam and Brian were exactly that demographic because they were looking for things online that were considered haunted. They wanted to see if ghosts and the paranormal were real. And so they were eager to buy the Dybbuk box and test it out. And so 3 weeks later, when this package finally arrives in Missouri at their house, Brian was still out at class, but Sam was home. So he receives the package. He eagerly brings it into the kitchen. He unpackages it and he sets it on the kitchen table. And just a few minutes later, Brian comes home. And Brian would say in interviews that when he walked in, it smelled like someone had peed all over the apartment, like there was urine everywhere. And he's walking around thinking, what happened? This smells so bad in here. And he walks into the kitchen where it was the strongest smell. And there's Sam proudly standing next to this awful looking chest, which was of course the Dybbuk box. And he realizes, Brian does, that the Dybbuk box is what smells like urine. And he goes, Sam, do you smell that? And Sam's like, yeah, that's the smell of ghosts. Sam would pick it up and go, ooh, to Brian as soon as he walked into the kitchen. And Sam joked about how he couldn't wait to sleep in the same bed as the Dybbuk box. They were just making a big joke out of it. Sam had also set up a blog where he was going to document everything that happened from day one of receiving this Dybbuk box to whenever they got rid of it or till whenever something happened. And for the first 2 weeks they had the Dybbuk box in their possession, nothing did happen. But when Sam started bringing the Dybbuk box out and leaving it right in the middle of these huge parties they would throw, where people were spilling beer on it and they were opening it up and putting things inside of it and making jokes with it, when they were doing that to the Dybbuk box, suddenly they started seeing a pretty significant uptick in strangeness inside of their house. It started with their technology. Sam's laptop crashed and the hard drive was unrecoverable, so he had to replace his laptop. All of their watches just didn't work while they were in the house. No matter what they did, no matter when they fixed it, the watch just simply did not work. Their Xbox would not turn on, but when they brought it to another person's house, it worked just fine. It just couldn't work inside of their house. And the toaster, anytime you turned it on, it basically immediately incinerated whatever you put inside of it. But none of these technological difficulties were frightening to Sam or Brian. They were just frustrating. And I don't even think they were connecting them with the Dybbuk box. It was just this thing that was happening to them. It wasn't until the light bulbs in their house started bursting in the middle of the night that they started to get pretty creeped out about some of the things that were happening in their apartment. That now all of a sudden it did seem like, maybe if the Dybbuk box really is cursed, this might be how it would manifest. And so they'd replace the light bulb and then sure enough it would burst again. And they couldn't keep light bulbs in because they kept popping. And so their house was dark a lot of the time. But the worst part was when they had this massive insect infestation inside of their apartment. And they were really localized around the Dybbuk box. All these insects would come out of the walls, out of the toilets, out of the sink. They'd come from behind the fridge and they would all kind of converge on the Dybbuk box and go inside of it. The Dybbuk box at one point was swarming with insects all over and they had to shut the door. They couldn't even go in the room with the Dybbuk box because it was just covered in insects. But despite how scary this was for the boys, they had become kind of like a cool talking point on campus because of Sam's blog that a lot of other students were following. And so the boys kind of liked the clout they got with that, and they decided they didn't want to get rid of the box after all. But it wasn't long after the insect infestation that Sam began losing all of his hair, and at the same time, he started having this constant hallucination that there was an old woman in his peripheral vision on either side of his head pretty much at all times. Anywhere he went, there basically was someone he couldn't quite see following him around. Whether he was well rested, whether he was totally exhausted, it didn't matter. He always saw this shrouded dark figure that he believed was an old woman, and it scared him so much he couldn't sleep, and so he began going into Brian's room and sitting on Brian's bed because it was the one place he felt a little bit of comfort. And as he's sitting on the bed, he would see these dark figures standing on either side of him all night. Finally, no matter how cool their blog was, it became too much and they decided we have to get rid of the Dybbuk box. And so they put it on eBay, and very quickly it gets sold to a guy named Jason, who is this museum director over at this other university in Missouri. And he had actually been following along with Sam's blog. He was very interested in what was going on with the Dybbuk box. And when it was listed for sale, he was all over it. He wanted to buy it. So the boys eagerly ship off the Dybbuk box, and Jason receives it in the middle of a workday. So he puts the package in his truck and he goes upstairs and he works for the day. And then afterwards, when everyone's left the office, he goes downstairs, gets the package, brings it back up to his office, puts it on his desk, and he cuts open the packaging. Jason decided he wanted to evaluate the Dybbuk box the way he would evaluate any other antique or item that was coming into the museum that he was the director of. And so Jason starts by taking a whole bunch of pictures all around the outside of the Dybbuk box. And then he gets his blacklight out and he begins scanning around the outside. And he finds all these traces of wax all over the outside, which leads him to believe this was probably used in some sort of ritual. And then he takes a deep breath and he sits down right in front of the Dybbuk box and he pops off the lock, he gets ready, and he opens the doors and the drawer slides out with that whole mechanical device. It all kind of comes open and Jason's totally let down because nothing happens. And part of him thought, like, if this thing is haunted, as soon as you open it up, the haunting's going to begin. And nothing happened. And he's pretty let down about it. And so ultimately, after staring at it and looking at the pennies that are in there and the Shalom statue and the locks of hair, he's just kind of let down by it. And he decides, okay, I kind of got my hopes up for something. This was clearly a hoax. There's nothing going on here. It's just a random old chest. And so he closes it up and he puts it on another desk that wasn't the one that he worked at, but was just kind of another table inside of this office that he shared with some other people. And he figured it would be a good talking point to tell his colleagues about, and it would be kind of like a showpiece. So the next day, his colleagues come in and he explains what a Dybbuk box is and the history around it, that it's supposed to be haunted and, it makes people sick and gives people strokes. And, there's been insects that have been known to come out of it and go into it. It's this very creepy thing. And his colleagues are like, wow, that's pretty cool. But they don't think much of it until all of the electronics inside of their office start to fail. Namely, their computers start crashing and their IT department comes up and they're like, we don't know why this is happening, but sorry, we can't recover it. And the light bulbs kept going out to the point where they went out and got this huge pack of extra light bulbs to replace the light bulbs as they went out. Something they never had to do before, but all of a sudden the Dybbuk box is in the room and the light bulbs are going out left and right. And then finally, Jason's coworkers that share that space with the Dybbuk box, they all got sick and they blamed the Dybbuk box. They said, you know what? We were fine until that thing came in here. Now all of a sudden our computers don't work, the lights don't work, and we're getting sick. Get rid of it, Jason. So that day after work, Jason goes and takes the Dybbuk box, puts it in the back of his truck, and his truck had a cover on the back. So he secures it in the back, he drives home, and he doesn't want to bring it inside because it just seemed weird to bring a cursed object inside that his coworkers just made him get out of their space because it was making them sick and it was ruining their things. So he thinks, okay, I'll leave it in my truck overnight and I'll figure out what I'm going to do with it tomorrow. He goes inside, he says hi to his family, and before long it's time for bed and Jason goes to sleep. In order to understand what happened to Jason, you need to understand the layout of his house. When you open the front door, you walk inside and there's a wall on your right-hand side. That's the side of the house. And you walk forward about 5 or 6 feet, and on your left is a staircase that goes up to the second floor. If you walk up that staircase, straight ahead of you is going to be a bathroom. If you go left and walk down the hall another 5 or 6 feet, you come to the master suite where Jason and his wife would sleep. If you walk through that door, there is a wall on your left where there's a big bay window that looks out onto the street. And there's a big street light that sits right outside that projects very orangey yellow light into their room at night. Even though they have a shade up, it's this orange glow that comes through this window right here on this side. And then on the other side of the room is the bed. And the bed is situated where the feet are pointed towards this window over here, and the head of the bed is against this wall. And it's centered on this wall here. And Jason, if you were looking overhead at the top of this bed, Jason's on the left side, so he's the farthest into his room, and his wife is the closest into the room. So that night, Jason goes to bed and he falls asleep. But just a couple hours later, he wakes up suddenly and he can't move his body. He can only move his eyes. He's laying on his back, and the light from the street light is very strong. It's this orangey glow in their whole room. And he's laying there trying to move his hands and his legs, but he can't do it. And as he's doing that, he starts hearing footsteps out on the stairs. And they're distinctive sounds. Slow, plodding steps all the way up to the second floor. And Jason's laying here with his eyes looking towards the door because his door is open and he can barely see into the second floor landing. And he's waiting to see who came up the stairs. And his heart's racing and he's looking, and out of the corner of his eye, he sees what looks like a dark figure begin to walk into the room. And his heart starts racing even faster when he can tell it's definitely not someone he knows. It's this woman, this older woman with a shawl over her head, and her head is tucked down so he can't see her. And this is all out of the corner of his eye. And because of the orange hue coming in from the window, he can definitely tell that there is a real solid figure right there. This is not in his imagination, it's right there. And this woman begins shuffling her way across the foot of the bed, and right at the foot of the bed, as Jason's looking at her, she turns and looks directly at him. And then she runs around the corner, and she looks down at him, and she takes her fingers and she drives them into his eyes. And Jason thinks it's real, and he's screaming in pain, and he wakes up, and his wife is grabbing him, and she's like, Jason, what's wrong? And he's like, what's going on? And she says, honey, it's just a bad dream, you're fine. And he's shaken up, his heart's still racing from this dream he's just had. And he's trying to think, that felt really real. And he's feeling his eyes. And he can't believe that that was a dream. That was the most vivid dream he's ever had in his life. And so eventually he goes back to sleep. And then the next morning when he gets up, he goes in the bathroom and he looks at his eyes, and they're all red around the outside, and the whites of his eyes are covered in blood. His eyes look horrible, like he's having this terrible allergic reaction to something, or it looks like someone might have punched him in the eyes, or maybe gouged his eyes. That's how it looks. And his wife comes in and she's like, what happened to you? And he's like, oh my God, I have no idea. It was around this time that Jason began to think the Dybbuk box might just be cursed, because the two previous owners have said in their disclosures on eBay that horrible, vivid dreams, just like the one he had, to include physical manifestations, are part of having this Dybbuk box. Jason considered just dumping this thing in a dumpster somewhere, but then he was concerned that he might be passing on this Dybbuk box to someone who wasn't ready for it. And so he decided he would give it another day and he would do some research about how to properly dispose of a Dybbuk box. And so that night when Jason came back from work, he left the Dybbuk box in his truck covered up in his driveway. And so Jason goes inside, he has dinner with his family, and then he's sitting down in the TV room and he's watching TV with his son. And as they're watching TV quietly, Jason hears his son say, hey Dad, who is that? And he looks over at his son, and his son is pointing behind him. And Jason turns around, and standing right behind him is the same woman who had come in his room with a shawl on, that gouged his eyes out in his dream, and then she suddenly disappears. And Jason's looking at his son like, you just saw that too? And he's like, yeah, who was that? And so Jason grabs his son, he yells for his wife and says, we have to leave the house right now. His wife comes downstairs and she's like, what's going on? And he was like, I will explain in the car, and we have to take your car. And so his wife sees how serious Jason is, and she says, okay. And they get into her car and they drive down the road. And that's when Jason explains what's going on with the Dybbuk box and how he and his son just saw the same woman that he had seen in his dream the night before that gouged his eyes, and his eyes were red. And his wife's starting to get really scared, and his son's really scared of what's going on. And so the solution they came up with was they were going to drive back to their house, drop Jason off, who was going to get in his truck where the Dybbuk box is still in the back. It's still locked in the back of the truck. And he's going to drive it a few miles outside of town to a rental property they owned that no one was staying in. And he was going to put it in the basement. And it was going to stay there until they figured out how to dispose of it. Because they didn't like the idea of just dumping it somewhere, because they felt like if this is real and it's actually this cursed Dybbuk box, then somebody else is going to be cursed by this Dybbuk box unless we find a way, or at least attempt to find a way to contain it and destroy it. And so Jason gets dropped off, he gets in his truck, he drives to the rental property, he puts it in the basement, he seals it up, and he goes back to his house. Once Jason got back to his house, his wife and his son came back as well. And that night, Jason would go on eBay and he would find the contact information for Kevin, the original owner of the Dybbuk box after the estate sale. And he called him that night, and Kevin actually picked up, and the two of them spoke, and Kevin ultimately agrees to help Jason find a way to properly dispose of this Dybbuk box. And what Kevin offers to do is drive back to the house where he had originally purchased this Dybbuk box and see if he can get some more information about what it is and what they do with it. The next day, Kevin, the antique shop owner, he goes back to the house where he originally bought the Dybbuk box at the estate sale. He knocks on the door, and an old woman comes to the door, and Kevin introduces himself, and he says, hey, I was here not too long ago, and I purchased lot 29 that included that Dybbuk box, and I wanted to know some more information about it. And the woman reacted, and she's like, I told my family not to sell that. I know what was inside of it, and I know you're not supposed to open it, and I tried to tell my family, and they didn't listen. I really hope you didn't open it. And Kevin's like, actually, yeah, I did open it. And he described all the horrible things that happened. And he described selling it and all the subsequent owners, how they've had all these issues and how they've arrived at this place now where Jason in Missouri is having all these issues and they're trying to find a way to dispose of it. And that's when Sophie describes what's actually inside of this box. Sophie said she lived in Poland before World War II with her cousin Havila, who was the woman who had passed away, and all her things were being sold at the estate sale. And she said that at the time, it was all the rage to have seances and try to talk to dead people and spirits, and they would just do it for fun. Sophie, Havila, and their mother, they would do this for fun. And Havila had made this Ouija board where she'd stitched letters onto this blanket, and they put it over this table, and they would all hold this pendant that was suspended by a chain, and they would ask questions, and they would hope that, a spirit that they were interacting with would interact with this chain, and it would swivel around the pendant, and it would point to the different letters whenever they asked a question, and it would spell out, whatever their answer was. And Sophie said nothing ever happened. It was just kind of a fun thing for them to do. But one time it did work, and they said the chain would go rigid, and it would point over and over, and it would spell the words, release me, release me, release me. Sophie said the women were incredulous and didn't believe it at first, but then they started to worry that if they didn't help this thing, that if it were a Dybbuk and were a malevolent spirit, it would find a way to attach itself to one of them. And so Sophie said they devised this ritual where they released it, but into this wine box that they were able to shut and lock. And that wine box became the Dybbuk box, and that Dybbuk box is the same one that was sold to Kevin. Kevin told Sophie that, what do we do? We've already opened it up. And she said, you need to contact a rabbi. And so they would call a rabbi, and apparently they were able to reclaim the Dybbuk inside of the box and lock it and put it away in a secret location where it's been since 2003. And apparently since it's been sealed off, Jason and Kevin have said they've experienced no demonic activity, and they never plan to tell anybody where this thing is because they don't want anyone else to have even the opportunity to reopen the Dybbuk box and have to deal with all the horrible things that they went through.
One morning in the spring of 2009, 39-year-old Dr. Benjamin Gilmer quietly got dressed before dawn without waking his sleeping wife and young son. He walked out the front door of his home in Asheville, North Carolina. He got in his car and pulled off into the foggy morning. Benjamin drove about 15 miles until the city streets became narrow country roads. In the distance, he saw the peaks of green mountains jutting into the sky. The area was breathtaking. But Benjamin's stomach was in knots. He was about to start his new job as a doctor at the Cane Creek Clinic, a rural medical center in the small town of Fletcher. A few minutes later, Benjamin turned off the main road and into the driveway of an old, repurposed farmhouse. The farmhouse was the clinic's location, which had been founded by another doctor whose last name was Gilmer, except this doctor's name was Vince Gilmer. Benjamin found it odd that he happened to share the same last name as the previous doctor. He knew it would confuse some patients. In fact, having the same last name as the clinic's founder had almost kept him from getting the job. The board of directors was hesitant to hire him because the first Dr. Gilmer had done something so heinous that they wanted to completely disassociate themselves from that name. Dr. Vince Gilmer had murdered his own father and mutilated the corpse 5 years earlier on June 28, 2004. He was now serving a life sentence in prison. Benjamin Gilmer understood why having the same last name as this killer would give the board of directors pause. But Benjamin was grateful that they gave him a chance. His goal wasn't to work in a big hospital or make a ton of money, it was to help people who needed it most in small communities. Benjamin parked, then got out of his car and walked toward the clinic. He took a deep breath and then stepped through the creaky front door. The clinic wouldn't open for another 10 minutes, but there were already a handful of people sitting in the waiting area reading the local paper. A few people glanced up at him, but no one gave him a strange look. He smiled and waved back, relieved that he didn't seem to be causing any confusion. Benjamin headed into the back and greeted his staff, who had already been told Benjamin was not related to the other Dr. Gilmer. Benjamin checked his busy schedule. He had back-to-back-to-back appointments from 8 a.m. to 6 p.m. He refilled his coffee mug, put on his white coat, and got to work. By the end of the day, 6 p.m., he was tired and ready to go home. But he had one more patient to see, a woman who was there for a follow-up on her arthritis. But when he walked into the exam room, he was startled by what he saw. The woman was sitting on the exam table with her head down almost to her knees, and she was hyperventilating. Her breaths were shallow and her face was pale. She was clearly having a panic attack. But as soon as Benjamin stepped all the way into the room and shut the door, the woman looked up at him and visibly began to relax. Her breathing slowed down and her color started to come back. Once she had steadied herself, she reached out and touched Benjamin's shoulder and apologized. When the nurse had first mentioned she'd be seeing Dr. Gilmer, she was terrified because she thought it would be the other Dr. Gilmer, the murderer. Benjamin smiled and told her it was all right, he was just glad she was feeling better. Once the woman was ready, Benjamin began to examine her, and as he checked her vitals, they talked about the other Dr. Gilmer, Vince Gilmer. Despite her fear that it was going to be the first Dr. Gilmer walking into the exam room, she had said to the new Dr. Gilmer that she actually only had fond memories of Vince Gilmer. She remembered Vince as being very kind and caring before she found out he had murdered his father. One time when she was at the clinic, she'd seen Vince rescue a mouse from a no-kill mousetrap. Then he walked out back and released it right next to a koi pond he'd built himself. He cared deeply about every living thing, which had made his crime all the more shocking to her. Benjamin thanked her for being so open. He prescribed some medication for her arthritis, walked her back to the waiting room, and then he returned to his office. Benjamin wrote up his patient notes from the day, and then he left the clinic. But on the way home, he kept thinking about Vince Gilmer. He wondered how a man who had been a doctor, committed to saving lives, was now serving a life sentence for murder. His mind wandered as the trees on the side of the highway whipped by. Benjamin blinked and forced his eyes to stay on the road. He didn't want to think about a murderer, especially one who shared his last name. Finally, Benjamin arrived home, he had some dinner, and then he crawled into bed and fell asleep. Over the next several months, Benjamin tried to push thoughts of Vince Gilmer out of his head. Taking over the clinic was a demanding job, and Benjamin often worked 14-hour days. But even when he was busy, he couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to Vince's story. Time and time again, longtime patients who came into the clinic who had known Vince Gilmer would tell Benjamin about Vince's generosity and compassion, how he would take payment in the form of corn and tomatoes from patients who could not afford to pay the bill, how he still made house calls, how he treated everyone with decency and respect. Benjamin just couldn't believe someone like Vince could transform into a violent criminal with no explanation. He wondered if there could be a medical explanation for Vince to snap and become this killer. Did something break inside of him? Until he knew more, Benjamin just could not let it go. A few weeks later, Benjamin's receptionist walked into the clinic with a stack of newspaper articles about Vince Gilmer. She knew about Benjamin's interest in the case and had done some research on her own at the local library. Benjamin eagerly sat down at his desk at the end of the day, clearing away his medical reports and charts to focus on the newspapers. He didn't know what he was looking for, but he was excited to find out any new information about Vince Gilmer that was not just word of mouth. As he read the articles, Benjamin discovered that Vince had actually been about Benjamin's age when he killed his father, Dalton Gilmer, 5 years ago. Dalton had been diagnosed with some form of schizophrenia and Alzheimer's, which is a form of dementia. He had been living in a psychiatric hospital that treated Alzheimer's patients. The part about schizophrenia caught Benjamin's attention. He wondered if Vince inherited a genetic vulnerability to the crippling mental disorder. But as he thought more about the possible link, it seemed unlikely. Schizophrenia typically appears in early adulthood, and he doubted that Vince could have developed the disease without any prior signs. There are some cases that appear later in life, but they're rare. Whatever changed in Vince had changed suddenly. Benjamin kept reading. On the day of the murder, Vince was supposed to come help his father, Dalton, move to a nursing home, and witnesses saw him come pick Dalton up. But 2 days later, Vince reported his father missing, claiming he'd brought his father back home, and then he'd probably just wandered off. Vince had no idea that the police had already found his dad's body on a road 2 hours' drive from the hospital, and there was evidence linking Vince to the murder. The articles said that Vince had told police during the investigation that he had not been feeling like himself lately because he was withdrawing from an antidepressant medication called Lexapro. People who suddenly stop taking antidepressants can experience a range of symptoms, including trouble sleeping, nausea, and psychological reactions such as suicidal impulses or psychosis. The articles also said that Vince had gotten seriously injured in a car accident about a year before the murder, and after that, he and his wife had divorced. Now, Benjamin's mind was racing. Was it possible that the combined effects of antidepressant withdrawal and a bad head injury from a car accident could have dramatically altered Vince's personality? Could they have transformed him into a murderer? It was getting late, and he should have been home by now. His wife was probably wondering where he was. But before Benjamin shut off his light, he noticed a blurry photo of Vince from one of the articles. He looked big and burly. He had a shaved head, and he was wearing a prison jumpsuit. His eyes seemed haunted. Benjamin suddenly felt like he was trying to build a jigsaw puzzle without all the pieces, but he didn't have the time to figure out what he was missing. Over the next year, Benjamin's life got much more hectic. He and his wife had a second child, and he was just so busy running the clinic that ultimately he was not able to keep up his research into Vince. And if Benjamin was being honest with himself, he knew the Vince Gilmer subject was taking up way too much space in his head. His obsession with this murderer would just have to wait until he had more time to think. In the spring of 2011, 3 years after Benjamin began his research into Vince, Benjamin was in a meeting at the clinic when he received a phone call. The caller identified herself as Sarah Koenig, a journalist from New York. Sarah had heard about the case of the previous Dr. Gilmer, and she was interested to find out more. In fact, Sarah wanted to do a podcast about it. She asked Benjamin if he would be willing to speak with her about his experiences as the second Dr. Gilmer at the clinic. Benjamin was intrigued by Sarah's call, but he was also hesitant. He didn't want to get sucked back into Vince's dark past, so he told her he was actually not interested in doing the podcast. But after he hung up, his old feelings began to resurface. He wanted to move on with his life, but he just couldn't forget about Vince Gilmer. It took another year, but Benjamin would call Sarah back. Now he wanted to be a part of her project if she was still interested. Shortly after Benjamin called in the spring of 2012, Sarah came out to North Carolina and they got to work. Sarah interviewed Benjamin first. To his surprise, Benjamin felt himself tearing up as he talked about Vince's story. It was cathartic for him to finally let out how invested he had become in this stranger's life. Together, he and Sarah planned to interview Vince's old patients, friends, and coworkers. The first person on their list was Vince's old office manager, Terry. She had seen Vince's decline firsthand. So one night, they met Terry in another office space near the clinic. Sarah prepared the recording equipment and then tapped the microphone to test it. Benjamin could see Terry shift in her seat. She was nervous. He understood. He'd felt the same way. Sarah pressed the record button, and the interview began. Terry took a deep breath and described when she thought Vince's personality first started to change. It was about a year before the murder, in 2003. Vince's truck had hit a telephone pole and overturned. First responders found him unconscious, and an ambulance had rushed him to Mission Hospital in Asheville. And when Vince woke up, he didn't know his own name, and he didn't recognize his wife. Terry said Vince's amnesia cleared up after about 24 hours, but after that crash, he was never really the same. Her voice shook as she told Benjamin about how Vince had filed for divorce, moved into a new house alone, started drinking heavily, and began dating random women. He got into debt and spent money he didn't have. Clearly, Vince's mental health had gone steadily downhill in the last year before the murder. And so Benjamin wondered why Vince was even found mentally competent to stand trial. Benjamin decided he needed to see the official documents from Vince's trial in hopes of getting some new insight. The week after Sarah came to visit, Benjamin drove to Washington County, Virginia, where Vince's trial had taken place. He asked the court clerk for all documents available on Dr. Vince Gilmer and received a thick stack of papers, hundreds of pages long. It was the transcript from Vince's trial. Vince had insisted on representing himself in court and argued that he was not in his right mind when he murdered his father due to antidepressant withdrawal. He had stopped taking them cold turkey 2 days before the murder. But Vince didn't present any expert medical witnesses who could corroborate this theory, and he didn't even bring up the bout of amnesia he suffered after his car crash. The prosecution argued that Vince was faking an illness to escape punishment. They presented a psychiatrist who had judged Vince to be perfectly sane the night he killed his father. The jury agreed and found him guilty and sentenced him to life in prison. Benjamin wasn't sure what to think. On the one hand, a traumatic brain injury and antidepressant withdrawal could explain the dark turn in Vince's personality. On the other hand, he could see why the jury believed the prosecution. Killing and mutilating your father is something a sociopath would do. When Benjamin got back home, he talked it over with Sarah. They both agreed there was only one way to get the full story. The two Dr. Gilmers would have to meet directly. It took several months to organize, but in early January of 2013, Benjamin and Sarah made the 2-hour drive to Wallens Ridge State Prison in Virginia. The maximum security building was huge and flat, a cinder block fortress nestled deep in the Virginia mountains. After Benjamin parked and stepped out of the car, he immediately heard the buzzing sound of the electrified razor wire lining the prison's fence. He noticed snipers perched on guard towers. The place made Benjamin extremely nervous. He and Sarah left their belongings in the car, they showed their IDs to the guard, and then walked through the metal detectors. Finally, they were led down a hallway to the visiting area. The room was large and filled with long metal tables. Benjamin could smell old food and bleach. It almost felt like a school cafeteria, except for the fact that prison guards loomed in the corners, and each table had a metal divider down the middle to separate inmates from visitors. Benjamin and Sarah sat down at one of the tables and waited. A few minutes later, an old man shuffled slowly into the room. He was rail thin with a gaunt face and barely any hair. Benjamin watched the old man walk, thinking he must be visiting someone else. But then the old man pulled a chair out at their table. It was Vince. He was 50 years old, but looked nothing like the burly, broad-shouldered man Benjamin had seen in older photos. Benjamin could feel his heart pounding. This was the man he'd been fixated on for the past 4 years. He took a breath and then introduced himself, but it seemed like Vince barely heard him. Vince kept opening and closing his mouth, almost like he was chewing, except he didn't have any food in his mouth. Benjamin could see he was missing most of his teeth. Vince's eyes wandered around the room as he clenched and unclenched his hands. He was trying to speak, but he was clearly struggling. Slowly, Vince began to talk about the voices in his head and how his brain didn't work. After a while, he seemed to run out of things to say. There was an awkward silence, so Sarah stepped in. She followed up with questions that Benjamin didn't have the nerve to ask. Questions like why Vince killed his father and whether he planned it. Vince seemed to expect the questions. He slowly answered that he hadn't planned it. He said the voices in his head told him to do it, but there was just a lot he couldn't remember. Looking at him now, Benjamin felt certain that Vince was not a psychopath. He wasn't evil or manipulative, and he wasn't faking these symptoms. He was suffering, and for years, nobody had believed him. Now, Benjamin had new questions for himself. What exactly was Vince sick with? And was there any potential treatment? Just then, a prison guard walked over and told Benjamin and Sarah that their time was up. Vince stared at them, his eyes brimming with tears, and he asked them to please help him. Benjamin promised he would try, and then he and Sarah said goodbye. They left the prison and drove the winding roads back to North Carolina. About a week after visiting the prison, Benjamin realized he might actually know someone who could help Vince. Benjamin grabbed his phone and he called a colleague named Dr. Steve Bowie. Benjamin knew Dr. Bowie from a nearby medical school where they both sometimes taught classes. Dr. Bowie was a psychiatrist and an expert at diagnosing brain diseases and mental illnesses. Benjamin called Dr. Bowie up and poured out Vince's story. Benjamin told Dr. Bowie that, in his opinion, Vince had been showing signs of some kind of brain disease for at least a decade, and his condition had only deteriorated since he was imprisoned, and if Vince didn't get help soon, he could die. 3 days later, Benjamin drove with Dr. Bowie through the Virginia mountains, discussing Vince's case as they headed back towards the prison. Dr. Bowie didn't think antidepressant withdrawal could be the answer. It had been 9 years since the crime, which meant it had been 9 years since Vince stopped taking his antidepressants, yet his symptoms seemed to have only worsened. There was just no way he could still be going through drug withdrawal after so much time. And Dr. Bowie didn't think Vince's car accident could explain his behavior either. He'd worked with many patients who had traumatic brain injuries, and their symptoms did not match Vince's. Benjamin was confused. He wanted to believe that Vince had been driven to kill by forces beyond his control, but if neither a traumatic brain injury or the Lexapro withdrawal had caused Vince to kill, then what could it be? Maybe, Benjamin thought, Vince belonged in prison after all. After almost 4 years of digging into Vince's case, Benjamin didn't want to believe that he could have been so wrong about Vince. Benjamin sighed, not knowing what to think. Benjamin and Dr. Bowie eventually arrived at the prison, and they parked the car in the prison's parking lot. Benjamin led Dr. Bowie through security, down the prison's echoey hallways, and into the visitation area. Vince eventually walked in, looking just as sick as the last time Benjamin visited. He seemed happy to see Benjamin, though, and he smiled. But then, after he sat down, his lips curled into an exaggerated frown, and he squeezed his eyes shut, and his hands trembled uncontrollably as he tried to lay them flat on the table. Dr. Bowie asked Vince questions about the night of the murder, and Vince sort of stumbled through a slow recounting. Dr. Bowie listened patiently, and when Vince finished, Dr. Bowie asked him something that was totally unexpected. He wanted to know what it was like growing up with his father. Vince looked off in the distance for a moment, then his voice dropped to barely above a whisper as he described painful childhood memories. His father was a Vietnam War veteran who drank to excess, especially after returning home from combat, and he was a cruel man who had sexually abused Vince for as long as he could remember. Vince tried to answer more questions, but after a while, a guard came over and said it was time to go. Back in the car, Benjamin asked Dr. Bowie what he thought of Vince. The psychiatrist leaned back in his seat with a thoughtful expression on his face. He told Benjamin that he was more certain than ever that Vince's condition had nothing to do with antidepressant withdrawal or a traumatic brain injury. But he was also convinced that Vince did not murder his father out of pure hate. In fact, he had a new theory for what was wrong with Vince. When he explained it, Benjamin just sat there, stunned. He'd never even considered something like what Dr. Bowie was suggesting. But if Dr. Bowie was right, it would explain everything. They just needed a DNA test to prove it. It took some time, but they did eventually get everything in order. Dr. Bowie had to get the prison hospital to obtain a blood sample from Vince, send it off for testing, and then wait for it to be processed. The DNA results came back a few months later, in March of 2013. Benjamin was at work, sitting in his rusty desk chair, when he saw an email notification on his computer from the prison hospital. His heart skipped a beat as he opened the email. The diagnosis was finally there in black and white. It explained everything, from Vince's car accident to his increasingly strange behavior to the murder that landed him behind bars. This is what really happened on the day that Dr. Vince Gilmer killed his father, and why he did it. On the afternoon of June 28, 2004, Vince left the clinic early. He drove home, he grabbed a canoe from his garage and lifted it onto the top of his pickup truck. He strapped the canoe down and then got back into his truck and drove across town. About an hour later, he parked in front of the huge, multi-story brick building where his father lived, Broughton Hospital. Vince went inside and told the receptionist he was there to pick up his father, Dalton. Dalton had been living at this hospital for 2 years, being treated for what doctors thought was schizophrenia and Alzheimer's. His overall health was deteriorating, and so Vince was there to check him out of Broughton Hospital and bring him to a nursing home in North Carolina where he could live out his final days. Vince helped his father out the door and into the passenger seat of the truck. Then Vince got into the driver's seat and he told his father he had a surprise. Instead of going straight to the nursing home, Vince was going to take him to one of his favorite places, a lake in Tennessee where they could canoe together. But while they were making this 70-mile drive to the lake, Dalton started making these horrible sexual comments towards his own son. Unfortunately, this was not anything new. Vince had heard it all before, and he could ignore it. But then his father started humming the tune of Baa Baa Black Sheep, the song that Vince's father used to hum while he abused Vince when he was a boy. For Vince, the sound of that song brought back a flood of traumatic memories. It was like a psychological trigger, and in that moment, something broke in Vince's mind. He began to hear voices all around him and inside his head demanding that he kill his father. The more he tried to resist, the stronger they became. The urge to kill his father became overwhelming. His head was pounding and he felt like he was losing control. The tires screeched as he swerved onto the side of the road and slammed on the brakes. The car stopped so quickly that his father's head jerked forward, then back, knocking into the headrest. Vince's eyes locked onto his dog's leash, which he'd left lying over the passenger seat headrest. The voices screamed at Vince to use it. And so Vince grabbed one end of this leash, he wrapped the other end around his father's neck, and then he pulled as tight as he could. Dalton was too sick and frail to fight back. He died of strangulation. Afterward, it was still. All Vince could hear were the crickets and his own breathing. Vince drove around for hours with his father's body sitting up in the passenger seat. Eventually, he pulled over on a rural road in Virginia. It was dark and deserted. Vince knew he'd just done something absolutely terrible, and as he sat in the truck, his heart began to race. The quiet in his head was now replaced by a jumble of whispers and then shouts. The voices were back, and their message was clear. They were telling him he was going to get caught unless he covered his tracks. Vince stepped out of the truck and walked around to the passenger side. He dragged his father's body and left it in a grassy patch on the side of the road. Then he rushed to the back of his truck and scooped up a pair of his gardening shears. He returned to the body, picked up one of his father's fingers, and began to cut. It took some effort because the blades were worn, but in a few minutes it was done. The finger landed on the dry leaves with a soft thud. Then, one by one, Vince cut the rest of his father's fingers off. The voices told him to take the fingers. So Vince gathered them up, got back into his truck, and sped away from the crime scene. A few hours later, a Virginia police officer found Dalton's body while it was still warm. The missing fingers shocked him, but he didn't have any problems figuring out who this victim was. He found name tags from Broughton Hospital in Dalton's shorts and in his shirt. Detectives quickly learned that Vince had picked Dalton up from the hospital that afternoon. Within a few days, police were at Vince's house in North Carolina arresting him for murder. They never found his father's fingers, even though Vince said he dumped them in his clinic's koi pond. But they did find blood-stained paper towels in Vince's truck. When Vince was tried, he had said he was just as shocked by his behavior as everybody else was. And now, nearly a decade later, Benjamin finally understood what was actually wrong with Vince's mind, and he now had the lab results to prove it. Benjamin read the words from the prison hospital's email over and over. Vince had Huntington's disease. Benjamin opened up an internet browser. He'd studied Huntington's in medical school, but it was so rare that he'd never diagnosed it in his career as a doctor. He began looking up articles in medical journals to refresh himself on the details. The articles described Huntington's as being a sort of cross between three diseases that are each absolutely terrible: ALS, Parkinson's, and Alzheimer's. It was a degenerative neurological disease, meaning it caused a person's brain cells to break down and die. This created physical and psychological problems like involuntary movements, cognitive impairments, memory loss, intense personality changes, and psychosis. The Huntington's diagnosis lined up with all the symptoms Vince experienced. And while the majority of Huntington's patients weren't violent, the disease could cause people to act out in ways they normally would not. Benjamin thought that Vince might have been struggling with multiple problems at once. While a traumatic brain injury and antidepressant withdrawal could not explain his actions on their own, they could have combined with Huntington's disease to create a perfect storm of mental and physical illnesses that totally changed Vince's personality and behavior. Benjamin kept reading. Huntington's was genetic, meaning it got passed down from parent to child. If someone's mother or father had Huntington's disease, then they had a 50-50 chance of getting it as well. Suddenly, everything clicked for Benjamin. The doctors at Broughton Hospital thought Vince's father, Dalton, had schizophrenia and dementia. But it was much more likely that Dalton had Huntington's. He was the one who passed it on to Vince. To Benjamin, the entire story was a tragedy. Two men, a father and son, who shared the same mental illness, both doing unspeakable things to each other. Then Benjamin read something else that made his heart sink even further. Huntington's is a death sentence. There is no known cure, and the disease will eventually kill its victim. All Benjamin could do was try to get Vince the mental health care he needed. Today, Benjamin still has a close relationship with Vince. His goal is to help Vince get out of prison and into a proper treatment facility. In January of 2022, the governor of Virginia granted Vince clemency on the condition that a place was found for him at a psychiatric hospital. Technically, this made Vince a free man, but it wasn't as simple as him just walking out of prison and into a hospital, because every public mental health facility in Virginia refused to take him in, and a stay at a private hospital was far too expensive. Benjamin continues to work hard to find a hospital for Vince, who remains in Wallens Ridge State Prison. He hopes that one day, the first Dr. Gilmer will receive the psychiatric care that he needs.
One morning in January of 2016, a 45-year-old woman named Lauren walked into an office building in West Virginia where she worked as an office manager, and she dropped her purse, her phone, and her cigarettes on her desk. It was a Friday, and so Lauren was in a really good mood because she was pumped about the weekend. The next day, Saturday, she and her husband Dan planned to go on this big hike together. They loved hiking, so that was going to be awesome. And then on Sunday, Lauren planned to stay home all day and cook one big meal because it had become a tradition in their family that on Sundays, Lauren and Dan's kids, they had 3 kids who were all grown up, they would come back home to their parents' house and they would have a big family meal together. And these dinners were definitely the highlight of the week for Lauren and for Dan because both of them were very family-centric. Lauren switched on her computer and then looked at her schedule and saw she had a whole bunch of meetings back to back to back that day. And so immediately she was worried that she would not be able to slip out that day and go for a quick walk, something she had recently been doing a lot of because her doctor had recently told her that she had a blood circulation disorder that was called peripheral vascular disease. And what that meant was the arteries that carried the blood from her heart down to her legs and her feet were becoming blocked. And so her legs and feet were not getting enough oxygen. So far, her only symptoms were the occasional leg cramp, but if the disease got worse, it could lead to pain and mobility issues, and also heart attack and stroke. Luckily, Lauren's doctor told her that she didn't need medication, she just needed to quit smoking, change her diet, and become more physically active. And Lauren had totally leaned into this and was being much more active and had changed her diet. She hadn't quit smoking yet, but she planned to. And so Lauren really felt like she was on the right track. And so as Lauren kind of began her day, going through her emails and thinking about when she's going to do this walk, her cell phone rang. When Lauren looked at the phone, she didn't recognize the number, so she decided to let it go to voicemail. And so Lauren forgot about her phone and just figured whoever this was, they'd call back or whatever, and she's doing her thing. But then she got another phone call. And when she looked, it was the same number calling her back. And this time, Lauren did pick up the phone, and when she said hello, on the other end of the line, she heard a police officer say in a very serious voice, "Am I speaking to Dan's wife?" And so right away, Lauren's heart began to race, and she would tell the officer, yes, what's going on? And all the officer would tell her is that Dan, unfortunately, was in a very serious car accident, and so you need to come to the scene right away. In an absolute panic, Lauren hung up the phone, she grabbed her things, she ran out to the car, and she floored her way to the address the police officer gave her. But when she got there, she saw there were so many police cars and ambulances and all these people that she couldn't even see what was going on, let alone park anywhere near where this accident happened. So she wound up parking her car around the corner, and then she got out and just sprinted towards all the police. And then when she got up to them, she basically began pushing people out of the way, and no one tried to stop her. They could tell, this woman must know the people involved in this crash. And so she pushed past all these people, and finally she can see through the crowd, and she can see her husband's car, and it's absolutely mangled. And there's all these first responders that are in a circle on the pavement, and she can tell there is somebody on the ground they're working on, and it's gotta be Dan. And so Lauren just began running towards that group of people, and as she did, they all stood up as if, there was nothing they could do. And on the ground, Lauren saw her husband. There was Dan lying in this huge pool of blood, just motionless on the ground. And so before she even got over to her husband, Lauren already knew what had happened. Dan was dead. And so Lauren let out this primal shriek and just rushed over to her husband and fell to the ground next to him, holding his body and crying hysterically. And all the EMTs and first responders, they knew this woman has just lost her husband. And even though she shouldn't be here right now, they just felt like they have to give this moment to her. And so the police and the EMTs and the rest of the first responders, instead of even talking to Lauren or trying to get her to go somewhere else, they just formed a big circle, shoulder to shoulder, around Lauren and Dan, and just allowed Lauren to grieve in private. About 2 hours later, Lauren returned to her home in a daze. Dan's body had already been transported to the morgue, and a police officer had driven Lauren back to her home where her 3 kids, her son and her 2 daughters, were now waiting for her. And so when Lauren went inside the house and went into the living room where her kids were, her kids, who already knew what had happened, they just immediately swarmed her and hugged her, and they all just cried together. I mean, this was so horrible and so unexpected that nobody knew what to do. Finally, Lauren tried to speak through her sobs, but when she did, she just couldn't get words out. It was like her chest was so tight she couldn't even speak. And then suddenly, Lauren realized this pressure on her chest was very real, and it was getting worse and worse, to the point where it was genuinely hard to take a breath in. And so Lauren actually said to her kids, "I think I'm having a panic attack." And so her daughter ran to the kitchen to get some water. And as she did, Lauren took a seat on the couch to try to calm down. But by the time her daughter came back with the glass of water, Lauren straight up just could not breathe. I mean, she was trying to pull air in, but it wasn't going in, and she was totally panicking. And so she looked at her kids and just mouthed the words, "I can't breathe." at which point the kids understood, like, this is way beyond just grief and sadness. Like, she's having a physical emergency right now. And so one of Lauren's daughters picked up the phone and called 911. A few minutes later, an ambulance arrived and they would take Lauren to a local hospital. But as soon as they got there, the doctors and nurses determined that very likely Lauren had had a heart attack. And even though she was basically stable right now, their fear is she was going to have another one, and this particular local hospital just lacked the resources and staff to actually treat Lauren. And so they pretty much immediately transferred Lauren to another hospital called the JW Memorial Hospital in Morgantown, West Virginia, because that hospital had a specialized cardiac care unit for people with very serious heart problems. Dr. Konrad Falinger was the cardiologist on duty at JW Memorial Hospital when Lauren was brought into the intensive care unit, followed closely behind by her 3 adult children. Now, Dr. Falinger was used to seeing worried families in the hospital, but Lauren's kids looked far more distressed than he was used to seeing. And when he spoke to Lauren's kids about, what's going on with Lauren, he would see why. The doctor would learn that this family has lost their father, their husband, just a few hours earlier, and the mother, Lauren, who's this patient, she laid with her dead husband out on the road in a pool of blood, and now these poor kids who've just lost their father, they're seeing their mother go to the ICU for what looks like a heart attack. I mean, this was a total worst case scenario where basically everything was going wrong for this family. Dr. Falinger did his best to push his emotions to the side. He didn't want to get wrapped up emotionally in this case, but at the same time, the doctor felt a very deep need to save Lauren. Like, let this family have one good thing happen to them. But Lauren's condition was pretty dire. Just like the doctors at that local hospital where Lauren went first, Dr. Falinger also suspected Lauren had a heart attack, very likely because of that blood circulation disorder that she had that basically clogged her arteries. When an artery in the heart gets blocked, the blood can't circulate in the heart, and so the heart dies. And preliminary testing on Lauren showed there was already signs of damage to her heart, in the same way that a heart attack would damage a heart. Her heartbeat was also irregular and it was too fast, and her blood pressure was dangerously low. And then also, when Dr. Falinger looked at some imaging of Lauren's heart, he could see that the majority of her heart muscle wasn't even moving. Basically, Lauren's heart was working way harder and way faster than it should be to accomplish nothing. And so, very quickly, Dr. Falinger realized that unless he was able to find the blocked artery in Lauren's heart and clear it, that Lauren would die. And so Dr. Falinger looked up at Lauren's 3 kids who were just standing there in silence, waiting for more bad news. And Dr. Falinger said to them, "Your mom needs to go into surgery right now." Nurses wheeled Lauren out of the ICU and into surgery, where she was immediately put under anesthesia. Once Lauren was ready, Dr. Falinger watched on a monitor as another surgeon fed a thin, flexible tube called a catheter into an artery in Lauren's leg and then fed it up towards her heart. This surgery was called cardiac angioplasty. Basically, that surgeon was going to use that catheter, that tube, and put it into Lauren's heart and then shoot dye through that catheter tube into the blood in Lauren's heart. And then Dr. Falinger and the other doctors could watch to see where this dye went. If the dye was pumped out of the heart like it should be, they'd see it go in all different directions. But if at some point on the monitor the dye just stopped inside the heart and didn't go anywhere, then that would mean they found a blockage. And so when the surgeon had the catheter in Lauren's heart, he injected the dye and they all watched on the monitor, and her heart functioned completely fine. There was no blockage in her heart. Now, the doctors weren't entirely convinced yet that there was no blockage, so they pulled that catheter out and they got a different one and they went through the exact procedure all over again to see if maybe that catheter was malfunctioning. But again, the second time, the dye didn't stop anywhere. Her heart seemed to be functioning totally normally. And so Dr. Falinger and the rest of the doctors and surgeons, they were all totally baffled, because what this meant was whatever was happening to Lauren, or whatever did happen to Lauren, was not a heart attack. But make no mistake, Lauren's heart was still absolutely dying. It was just some other thing killing it. Dr. Falinger went back to the drawing board, but realistically, there just weren't that many other things to consider with regards to what was happening to Lauren. Heavy alcohol use could in theory cause what was happening to Lauren, but Lauren didn't drink. Infection was another option, but Lauren showed no signs of having an infection. Certain chemotherapy drugs have been known to damage the heart, but Lauren wasn't on chemo and certainly would not have accidentally been exposed to chemo drugs without knowing about it. And so basically, Dr. Falinger had no clue what was wrong with Lauren, and he didn't even know where to start. And so Dr. Falinger just sat in his office feeling so bad about the fact that, these kids are almost certainly gonna lose their other parent. I mean, it was his duty to save Lauren, and he couldn't do it, and he just felt so bad. He couldn't even imagine how he was gonna deliver the news to the kids that, your mom's gonna die, and we don't know why. I mean, this was the worst for Dr. Falinger. He felt like he had failed as a doctor. But just then, Dr. Falinger has this epiphany. He remembers this weird medical article he had read somewhat recently, and he realized what was going on with Lauren and her family was like the same thing that happened in that article. And because Dr. Falinger did not have any other ideas of how to handle what was going on with Lauren, he decided he would just try to do what they did in that article, because if he was wrong, he had nothing to lose. So Dr. Falinger got up and he ran to Lauren's hospital room, and when he got in there, he saw Lauren's kids and he called them over to him. And he would tell them that he's going to give their mom some medication that's going to spike her blood pressure and keep it high, but then he needs them to gather around her and just talk to her like she's your mom. Talk lovingly, soothingly, remind her that you're still here and that everything is okay. And the kids, they all agreed to do this. And then Dr. Falinger, he gave the medicine to Lauren, and then he watched as her 3 kids circled up around the head of the bed, and they're all crying and holding their mom and telling her how much they love her and please come back to us, come back. And as they're doing this, Dr. Falinger just quietly walked out of the room, hoping this would work. And sure enough, just a week later, Lauren was all better. It would turn out the way in which Lauren lost her husband, both the suddenness of getting that phone call, combined with just the unthinkable horror of seeing your loved one on the road in a pool of blood dead. I mean, that situation was so stressful for Lauren that her brain released a ton of stress hormones into her body. So much so that these stress hormones literally paralyzed her heart. And so you can understand why all the doctors thought this was a heart attack, because this sort of looked like one. But this condition does have its own name. It's called stress cardiomyopathy. However, it's known by its more casual name, which is broken heart syndrome. Basically, Lauren loved her husband so much that to witness what happened to him and to learn about it so suddenly and abruptly, it nearly killed her. And it just so happens that a few months before Lauren was checked into the hospital, Dr. Falinger happened to read a medical article about broken heart syndrome. And the only way you can treat broken heart syndrome is just to try to keep the patient alive long enough that the stress hormones leave their body naturally, at which point their heart goes back to normal. And so Dr. Falinger was able to buy Lauren a little bit of time right at the end there by giving her that medicine that boosted her blood pressure. But Dr. Falinger told her 3 kids that really it was up to them to keep their mother alive. They needed to crowd around their mom and just talk to her and tell her that you love her, show her that you're here with her, give her a reason to fight and hold on. Even though she's not saying or doing anything, she's still alive and she can hear you. So talk to her. And so Lauren's kids just sat around their mother and just showered her with love and affection. And sure enough, a few days later, when Lauren did kind of come out of it and recover, she would say that she felt herself drifting off towards death. I mean, she really knew she was dying. But then she remembers hearing her kids calling to her and saying how much they loved her and to please come back. We need you. We already lost Dad. We got to keep you. And Lauren would say, that's the reason she's still here today, is because she held on for her kids. She felt like it was her duty to be here for her family. And so that's what saved her. Okay, here is the clip from our newest episode of Mr. Ballen's Medical Mysteries. Enjoy.
One summer afternoon in 2016, a young woman squeezed into the tiny bathroom on board a fishing vessel. She locked the door behind her and leaned in close to the mirror to get a good look at her face, in particular her left eye, which was disturbingly red. She used both hands to stretch the skin back around her eye, and the tissue along the edge of her eyelid looked totally strange. So she just ran a finger along it, and then suddenly something dislodged from her eye. It was the small sliver of fuzz, about the size and thickness of a carpet fiber. The woman leaned in closer to the mirror and delicately pinched this weird strand and pulled it away from her eye. She held it up to the bathroom light, trying to figure out what it was, and to her surprise, it was almost half an inch long. As she stood there wondering how on earth this weird piece of fiber had gotten wedged in her eye, something strange happened. The little strand began to move.
The sneak peek you just listened to was from an episode called It Moves, and you can listen to that episode and many more simply by looking up Mr. Ballen's Medical Mysteries on any podcast platform, give the show a follow, and then start your binge. So that's going to do it. If you enjoyed today's medically themed stories, be sure to check out our medically themed podcast. It's called Mr. Ballen's Medical Mysteries, and it's a whole bunch of stories about crazy medical mysteries. You can listen to it on Amazon Music or anywhere else you listen to your podcasts. Wait, don't go anywhere. If you're looking for more strange, dark, and mysterious videos,